Hello everybody and welcome to the channel. In today's video, we have a brilliant presentation by highly esteemed astrologer Joseph Crane titled The Lunar Nodes, A Fresh Look. And lastly, if you wish to view our current class, workshop and webinar offerings, please visit KeplerCollege.org. And without further ado, let's get into the video. Well, Joseph Crane has been an astrologer, teacher and writer since the late 1980s and has been involved with Kepler College since 2006. Over the years, he has conducted courses on ancient and modern astrology and counseling skills for astrologers, bringing together mythology, history, and philosophy with astrological purpose and technique. He has combined his knowledge of astrological technique and counseling experience to work with hundreds of clients and astrology students and as an active consulting practice. Joseph is the author of several fantastic books, some of them here: A Practical Guide to Traditional Astrology, Astrological Roots, The Hellenistic Legacy, Between Fortune and Providence, Astrology and the Universe in Dante's Divine Comedy, great title, and Astrology and the Lives of People, Finding Compassion, Character and Heroism in the Horoscope. Joseph has a BA in philosophy and a master's in counseling psychology and has been a Buddhist practitioner since 1980. He lives in southern Rhode Island with his wife Penny and little dog Winston. Great name, I love that. And you can find out more about Joseph at astrologyinstitute.com. So over to you, Joseph. It's always a pleasure to have you here, and I'm going to pass on the baton to you.
So during my increasingly long astrological career, I have been first entranced and then haunted by the lunar nodes. And they are used by contemporary astrologers to show inertia, past patterns, or to show potentiality for growth or evolutionary intent or future lifetimes, or how to get the best from your chart. And after practicing this way a few years, I became increasingly uncomfortable with them. And a few reasons. First of all, they didn't feel lunar enough to me. The North Node felt very much like this, like an exalted sun, and the South Node kind of like a depressed moon. So I wanted to do something about that. So I ignored it for a long time. And recently it has sort of come up. And I mentioned it a little bit in my book, Astrological Roots, but I first began back in a time when I had better hair, in 1998, writing an article on the structure of cycles, looking at Ptolemy and Rudyard in particular. And this year, having finished Astrology and the Lives of People, I wanted to go back to the nodes a little bit, because in my latest work, I was interested primarily in how do you get the most from the planets you have? How can I, with my Mercury in Sagittarius, really close to the sun, people would call it combust, but I'm stuck with it for an entire lifetime. How can I get the most from my Mercury in Sagittarius or from somebody's Mars in Capricorn? And so I mostly wrote a book with that in mind, primarily on the 7 visible planets. And then I began to think about the influence of the nodes, because I hardly mentioned them in that book. And so I had to go back and I had to look at some of my assumptions. I wandered back to my article that I wrote in 1998 from Mountain Astrologer. And so I tried to put together some ideas from the past, but also sort of adapting them to my own understanding of astrology. But I first wanted to mention myself as a modern traditional astrologer. And part of it is I don't think there's anything such as a traditional astrologer, in the sense that most astrologers who practice traditionally died centuries ago. But there are a few things that I wanted to mention here at the outset. First of all, that my purpose is to neither adhere to modern or traditional formulations, because what's past is past, what's present is present, and things do develop, but they also go back. Also, what I found, and this is some advice I give to students, is it's good to focus on a particular historical period. So I know traditional astrologers who really work with early medieval or late medieval, Hellenistic, Ptolemy, Valens, etc. By traditional, I mean from Stonehenge to William Lilly. After William Lilly, things begin to sort of go underground a little bit to emerge later as modern astrology. Also, traditional techniques and interpretations suggest modern possibilities. For example, the lot of spirit was not really used a whole lot, certainly compared with the lot of fortune in ancient astrology, but my sense is we can actually give it new life and new importance today. Also, and the most important, proposed imports from tradition are tested for relevance and their ability to help give clear and meaningful modern interpretations. So I am not a scholar, I'm an astrologer. I look at what makes sense, what's coherent, and what I can take to clients and give them greater understanding. If I don't understand something myself, or I'm very confused about its application, that's not going to work very well. Now, another thing to mention, and this is where we're not going to do a whole lot with the Indian concepts of Rahu and Ketu. We'll mention it later because it reemerges in a sort of an interesting way. But it's important to make the distinction between planets and positions. And by positions, I mean intersections and symmetries. So traditionally, these are not considered planets. Their signs are not important. What's important is where they are and what's ruling the signs. So, so the intersections between two circles, we have the ascendant descendant axis, midheaven IC, vertex anti-vertex, if you want to use those. Planetary and lunar nodes are all circle intersections. They're not planets, they're dealt differently from planets. Lot of fortune and spirit are symmetrical to the ascendant, for instance. So if I have my sun and moon are 23 degrees away, so my lot of fortune happens to be 23 degrees from my ascendant, because I was born at night. My lot of spirit is 23 degrees above my ascendant. That's a symmetry. Very different. We won't be dealing with them here. We're mostly concerned with the circle intersections and how they intersect and how they vary from each other. And interpretation, what planets are nearby, what planets are an aspect to. So it may turn out, for instance, that your lot of fortune is 25 degrees away from Mars. I shouldn't use a lot of fortune. Your ascendant is 25 degrees away from Mars. That's considered just as important. Modern astrologers will say, oh, Mars is on the ascendant. Modern astrologers are much more specific on planetary conjunction to angles. Ancient astrologers are more interested in them being in the same sign. So we look at what planets are nearby in aspect to, and of course, what the dispositors are. So my lot of fortune, my ascendant in Libra has the qualities of Libra because it's the ascendant, but it's also governed by Venus, of course. So we're going to launch into the lunar nodes. And we'll start with just training our eyes, because we're going to look at planetary conjunctions and at bendings. So here's Malcolm X. And by the way, there's a whole lot to say about all the charts we work with. But I'm just going to focus on the nodes, the bendings, and planets. So I don't want to tell Malcolm X that he should have been more Leo. That is not the point of Malcolm X. But here we have the north node, and 90 degrees away happens to be Saturn. Saturn would be at the northern bendings. Then we go down here, south node, and then southern bending. So we're going counterclockwise in the direction of the signs. And so let's do it again. Here is the chart for like right now. North node is 15 degrees of Aries. Notice where the moon is. The moon is 29 degrees, 35 minutes, which means it's very close to the solstice point, the highest of the sun's declination. But it's also working on a square to the north node at the northern bending. So its latitude is going to be from Cancer, but also adding a few degrees. And so it turns out that right now, all the times that the moon is in these northern degrees, the moon is going to be out of bounds. And that's because the north node is in Aries. And it turns out that the moon has a declination of 28 degrees and 36 minutes, which is almost 5 degrees higher than if the moon was just at 0 degrees of Cancer. So this is the kind of thing we're starting to look at when we look at the lunar nodes. And so we have 15 Aries, so 15 degrees of Cancer would be the northern bendings. 15 degrees of Libra would be obviously the south node. The southern bendings would be at 15 degrees of Capricorn. Now, remember, this is the moon's nodes. Different planets have their own nodes. Mercury's node is like 18 degrees of Scorpio. And so it might be interesting if Mercury were close to its own nodal axis. Here, we're not concerning ourselves with that. We're simply concerning with the moon. And so, as we'll see interpretively, when we look at the lunar nodes and the bendings, we'll be looking specifically for lunar type of issues. So this is what we have. What are the lunar nodes? They're equal dimensions of the moon's latitude cycle. So what's the moon's latitude cycle? It's, all right, first of all, what's the sun's declination cycle? Between the celestial equator, that's one circle, and the circle of the zodiac, the other circle. So that when the sun is in Aries Libra axis, it is overhead at the equator. And Aries is going to begin to go north like it is right now. And it will culminate, or its final position will be 0 degrees of Cancer. And then it begins to move south toward Libra, and then southernmost over the Tropic of Capricorn. So that's the sun's path. The moon's path with the sun is you take the apparent path of the sun, divided into our 12 signs of the zodiac. You also take the path of the moon moving around the earth. So what you're going to have is together, when the two circles intersect, we're going to have conjunctions of the north node and south node. When they part most extremely, you're going to have the moon or planets at the lunar node bendings. So this happens with all circles that are oblique to each other. And astrology is full of them, as we know. So let me stop here, have a drink of water, see if anyone has any. Callum, do you see any questions or comments or anything?
Yeah, we have a knowledgeable chat going on. But we have one question here, and you might get to this later on. They're
Okay.
asking, Mark is asking, can you please tell us more about the South and North Lunar Node in terms of our fate and mission in our lives in general? Thank you.
Oh, that's coming. That's coming. Is primarily on the effects of the planets that are conjunct or in square to. My feeling of astrology is that we have different dimensions and patterns and activities of our lives, and we have paths of growth or inertia in all of them. And so each planet has its own path, its own progress, perhaps. So I don't look at the lunar nodes as cornering the market on that, but instead they are ways to understand planetary positions in a more complete way. Anybody else?
We do, if everyone doesn't mind putting the questions they have in the Q&A box.
Yes, please. I'm sorry, I forgot to say that.
Yeah,
yes.
I should have said that at the beginning. We did have another one. I'll pop one out of the chat. Are the planets at the bendings inherently out of bounds? I think that's supposed to say.
By no means.
By no means.
No, because the bendings are in relationship not to the sun's path, but the moon's path around the sun. So the bendings will be near the maximum latitude up and down of the moon from the ecliptic, but they can have a declination of anything depending on where they are. And we'll look at examples of that.
Wonderful.
Okay.
Would you like to take some more, or would you like to move on?
Sure, bring it on.
Bring it on. Okay, wonderful. Let's see here. Since the moon moves away from the Earth at 0.3 inches or so, some astrologers say we will no longer have eclipses in 400 years, while others say thousands and millions of years. What are your thoughts?
None. I have no thoughts about that.
Okay.
Never heard of it. Might be interesting, but okay.
I'm not sure if you might have already answered this. Do the bendings mark the point between north and south?
Yes, they're in square to both of the nodes. One, the northern bendings going in the zodiacal order from the north node to the south node, and the southern bendings going from the south node back to the north node. We will end this talk with many examples of planets, of the nodes and planets in various positions. So this will become second nature.
Wonderful. Now we've got questions flooding in, so you let us know when you want to carry on.
Okay.
one here.
All right.
If one has a planet at the bendings and that planet has a significant transit coming up, what do you say?
It depends on the planet and the transit. Okay, let's see, bendings. Let's hold off on that particular one till we get into more detail.
Okay, when you consider conjunctions with the nodes, does that also include conjunctions with the lots?
No.
Okay, let's see. Will you please point out north and south bending on this diagram? Thank you. Which one is which on this picture?
Oh, okay, on this diagram. Yes, absolutely. I think it's in my notes, but I forgot to mention it. Okay. Here's the north node. Now this would be the moon on the north node or the bendings. So here we're going in the direct counterclockwise direction of the zodiac. Let's say here would be the moon on the north node. Here would be the moon squaring the two nodes, at which point the moon has maximum distance from the ecliptic. So it's going to be like 5.5 degrees north of the ecliptic. As then it moves south, southerly, I should say, and it intersects with the ecliptic here. That would be a conjunction to the south node. It continues going south, and here we will get the southern bendings when again there is the greatest distance between the two circles. I think soon I can put this in more concrete terms, but this is sort of how it's usually diagrammed.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Can the nodes be inaccurate? What if you identify with the nodes that come after your natal ones?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Yeah, I didn't. I was just reading it out. Sorry. Can the nodes be inaccurate? What if you identify with the nodes that come after your natal ones? I was trying to.
I don't understand, but I would like to answer the question of true node and mean node. Because the nodes can sort of zigzag, the true node is more difficult to calculate. So traditionally, they use the mean node. And usually they're only 1 or 2 degrees away from each other. So it's not something I spend a lot of time with. But often that question will come up. Okay, I should move on. If there's another question, Colin.
Okay, we've got plenty coming through, so we can carry on and come back to those. Yeah, they've just exploded through, and I'm trying to go through them. Okay.
This is great. I've always disliked just giving talks to screens. I like to give talks to people. A little more lively. So I think what I'll do is I'll continue and then we'll pause after what comes next. We're going into the Wayback Machine. Those of you my age who grew up on Mad Magazine and Rocky and Bullwinkle will recall the first diagram on the left. And remember, we're going from Stonehenge to Lily, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to start here. And we're going to start with the Bronze Age. And you may have wondered, like last week, how did they predict eclipses? How did they come up with the lunar nodes if these are not visible bodies? Because they're pretty concrete. So basically what they would do is do a calendar that would note rising and settings of the sun, moon, and the visible planets. As we know, the sun has a very consistent pattern of rising and setting. And in the good old days, before light pollution, and if you had a good view of whatever, and not some housing development going up right in front of you, you'd be able to note where, let's say, starting with the sun, various bodies would rise and set. So here, if we're looking east, this would be south, and this diagram would be the sun setting in Capricorn. We go here, we come closer to the sun setting in Aries, Cancer, Libra, back into Capricorn. So the sun's position, you can set your clocks by to be anachronistic. So they would also notice where planets were. And planets would have a certain range in relationship to the sun. Of course, the moon would range wildly within the course of a month. But they would also notice where the sun and moon would rise or set in relationship to the sun. And so, last week we had an eclipse. That meant that the sun and the moon would rise and set at about the same place as the sun. Full moon, you have let's say the sun setting in the west, the moon rising in the east. And if they're along the same plane, you could have a lunar eclipse. Now, obviously, there's going to be some variable. variability, and you can't always make a prediction like that. But you do this pattern month after month, year after year, and certain time sequences begin to happen. And so it turns out that every 18.6 years, there's a complete rotation in terms of being able to predict when the sun is aligned with the moon exactly, or when there's some variation. And so you can begin to predict eclipses. You don't need a computer. You don't need math. You just need to take note of different positions. So they would also notice when the sun and the moon are in the same place in the zodiac, when there's most variability back and forth. When there's greatest variability, that would be the moon at the bendings. So this is how we began to think about lunar nodes and eclipses. Now, obviously, in the Indian tradition, they made it very concrete, and that Rahu and Ketu were sort of planetary bodies that swallowed, excreted the moon or the sun. In the West, I think they were mostly interested in predicting eclipses. Thales made his reputation on an accurate prediction, evidently. And so this is what we're doing. We're using sunrise and sunset positions and the moon's variability within that range to predict eclipses. And this is sort of a digression, but we're heading toward a lunar standstill, a major lunar standstill in January. What that basically means is that when the node is exactly at 0 degrees of Aries, the north node, the south node is 0 degrees of Libra, you have the greatest range of declination of the moon. It's, again, every 18.6 years. So we're heading into that. It also means that the chances of the moon being out of bounds are greater than any other time. They're also called minor lunar standstills, and that happens with the north node is in Libra, and the declination range is smaller, or at the smallest. And so, as far as I'm concerned, this is one more way in which the tropical zodiac is somewhat miraculous, because we can use the tropical zodiac to really understand the relationship between the Earth and the sun. And also find that within apparent randomness in the sky, there are specific patterns that are lying underneath them. And that's very much the lunar symbolism that we use. So now we're going to go for our traditional references, and we're going to take a romp through a couple thousand years. And we'll start with Vettius Valens, we'll end with William Lilly. And the purpose is to watch how Western astrologers began to develop their understanding of how the lunar nodes would work. And I think what you're going to find is that the lunar symbolism continues throughout the sequence, although you're going to see different formulations. So we're starting with Vettius Valens, 2nd century CE, and he talked about elections. So when the moon, now this is the moon, not other planets, transversing, okay, the ascending node is the north node. Why? Because the northern hemisphere, the node would be moving closer to us. And the squares and diameters, so the squares would be the bendings, the diameter would be the south node. Guard against beginning anything or sailing or marrying or having an encounter or building, etc. Why? For that which comes about will be judged neither stable nor easily brought to completion. So there's instability that is lunar, rather inconstant and incomplete, subject to painful punishment and not enduring. The sun has, in its visibility, this quality of endurance. The moon, as we know, has phases, has rapid movements, is very much about, we could call it instability, we could also call it adaptation. So here's a little more valence and also a passage from Ptolemy. Okay, here's valence. Benefics on the ascending node, remember the north node. Birth will be successful and practical. If the birth should be found in middling circumstances or in subjugation, subjugation, I guess, would be slavery, middling circumstances would be most of us, will be raised up and come into reputation. So there's a quality of changeability here. The malefics, however, the changeability is the wrong way. And Ptolemy will talk more about the bendings than the others. If either the lights should be carried to the malefics on pivots, that would be the ascendant, horizon, meridian axes, especially when the moon is on the nodes or in the bendings, there could be handicaps. Of course, on the blameworthy zodiac, that's like 5 out of 12. So, it gives a lot of room for interpretation here. But this is the passage that I found most interesting. Here, Ptolemy's talking about who's in charge of the soul. And the soul here is our basic personality in its functional aspect. He wasn't interested in inner dimensions of being. He's talking about how we behave. And so he goes into this whole elaborate discussion of different planets being in charge. And then he says, the condition of the moon herself nevertheless makes a contribution. Chancing, I like that word, to be in the bendings of her southern and northern limit, okay, southern bending, northern bending, more versatile and resourceful and changeable. These are lunar words. Upon the nodes, keener and more active and readily changeable. So one person may look at this as unstable, another person may look at this as adaptive. I was particularly interested, I looked at the original Greek, and I found something that was very interesting. The word resourceful comes up. Those of you who have read your Homer know the word polytropon, of many twists and turns. This is given to Odysseus. And remember, Odysseus had to do all kinds of different things to get home. And once he got home, he had to be a beggar or act that way and appear that way so he could plot to overcome the suitors and all that. And Emily Wilson uses not twists and turns, but complicated. Barry Powell, resourceful. Polytropa could be many-sided. And that has to do, although Odysseus in many ways is cast as a solar hero, he also needed lunar responsiveness to get home. And interestingly enough, so what we have is a fairly positive interpretation of planets at the nodes and at the bendings. I looked in Neugebauer's Greek horoscopes. There are no mentions of the bendings for centuries after Ptolemy. So this was something that Ptolemy wrote about, and it's not clear whether they were used practically in astrology until about the 4th century. So later antiquity. We spent a little time with Artorius. And this is William Holden's translation, the ascending node. And here, what Rhetorius is doing is looking specifically at planets conjunct the nodes. So Jupiter or Moon or Venus or the Sun makes exiles, not exactly a positive rendition. Sun injures the father, but with the Moon makes mother disreputable. So again, we're seeing that there's a sort of corruption quality here. And, those were times like ours in which the wheel of fortune was turning up and down. The ascending node with Saturn and Mars does the same thing. And then he contradicts himself. The ascending node is good with the benefics, while the descending node is good with the malefics. That's a little different from what he just wrote. So maybe there's a scribal error, or maybe there's just confusion on how to use them. But then he goes into, later in his book, Rhetorius talks about the effects of planets and houses. And he uses the lunar nodes together with the planets, which makes me wonder whether he was also being influenced by the Indian tradition that would have come through Persia into Western astrology. So 10th in the north node with Moon, Venus, and Jupiter, pretty good planets. Fortunate person, distinguished lives. However, with the south, even with Jupiter and Venus, unstable, passionate, promiscuous, meaning changeable, and their affections, we'll call it. Or with Mars and Saturn, distress in youth, but then have good circumstances. Notice again, there's a sequence. It's not that one stays in the same condition for life, but that things shift up and down. Get things done through violence, domination. We're talking the malefics still here. Saturn with Venus, unstable in relationships with women, conjunct the south node. So what would Rhetorius say? So here's Thomas Merton's chart. I don't want to go too long without presenting birth charts, because that's what people get excited about. What would Rhetorius say to this Trappist monk who wrote a gazillion books, who is still quite influential, especially in a lot of liberal Christian circles? Rhetorius might say first, why are you praying so much? We have books like The Seven-Story Mountain, let's see. He doesn't have New Seeds of Contemplation is very good, especially if you want to spend a lot of your time on retreat. So here's what we have here with Merton is the North Node. This is a wonderful chart. North Node conjunct both Jupiter and Mercury in Aquarius. Notice that all of these positions are in trine to Saturn in Gemini. I would think this pretty positive. So and this is the 11th house. They didn't quite have room for all of these on my program.
Joseph, can I jump in with a question, a quite common one that's coming through?
Yes.
Yeah, what orbs do you consider for the planets, either at the bendings or maybe the conjunctions?
4 or 5. 4 or 5.
4 or 5? Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
4 or 5 degrees. Thank you. I meant to say that at the outset.
Thank you.
So here is like the same, it's within the same degree as Mercury, 2 degrees away from Jupiter. So what Rhetorius says, if the ascending node is in the 11th house, now he says Jupiter and Venus will be there, will have instability. Whatever he acquires, he will lose, which is interesting. When you join a Trappist monastery, you're going to lose a lot of things. After that, he will be successful. Obviously, this is not Venus, but Mercury here. If Saturn and Venus were here, ill in youth, but gets better afterwards. And so a hint of what I'm going to talk about later is that Merton was very much a synthesizer of different spiritual traditions, and he's somewhat of a modern visionary today, even though he died back in 1968. Okay, so let's go to the medieval era. And so here we're getting the language of the dragon's head and the dragon's tail. But notice how this is from Ben Dyke's Introduction to Traditional Astrology, which is a very good book, that the North Node, the dragon's head, similar to a benefic star, Venus and Jupiter. And here we're beginning to have the idea of the North Node being an increase or an enhancement. And that feels to me somewhat like an import from Rahu. But he also says that when the North Node is with the malefics, it enhances their evil. So North Node conjunct Mars would be like Mars on steroids. Then the South Node, truly evil, composed of the nature of Mars and Saturn. We'll be talking about that in a little bit. And again, and I put these in bold, we have the themes of diminution and reduction. And so with malefics, they would, quote, decrease their evil. And this is a trend that we'll find throughout the medieval tradition. Here's Al-Biruni, a few centuries afterwards. Many astrologers attribute a definite nature to the ascending and descending nodes. The former, North Node, warm and beneficent, increase again, latter cold, maleficent, and accompanied by a diminution of influences. Not everyone will accept all these statements. The analogy seems rather far-fetched. So often in the ancient and medieval tradition, people will sort of copy what they've heard from others, and sometimes they just do it without really agreeing to it. Ibn Ezra, century afterwards, famous Western Jewish astrologer. South Node, North Node, Dragon's Head, Dragon's Head to increase again, tail, the South Node to decrease. So when the malefics are with it, will increase its evil when it's with the North Node. When the benefics are with the tail, will decrease their good. So he's basically continuing the tradition. And we're rounded out by William Lilly. And notice how the dragon's head or the North Node has become masculine, the nature of Jupiter and Venus. It's interesting because us moderns look at the North Node almost in a solar category. The head of the dragon is himself a fortune. Yet the ancients do say that being in conjunction with the good, he is good. Conjunction with the evil planets, they account him evil. So even Lilly is sort of not quite sure. Tail, South Node, feminine. Evil conjoined with good planets, good conjunction with malignant planets, the same thing. But he's not quite sure. But he says he uses it anyway. He uses the North Node more of an enhancement, and the South Node more of a diminution. So let me stop here. We're sort of midway, which is good. Any thoughts, questions? Have I answered everyone's uncertainties?
Plenty of questions. Absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, let's go through some of them here. Do you include the nodes when they are involved in an aspect pattern? And does the aspect pattern, in quotes, count?
I tend not to use aspect patterns. Like you talk about T-squares and grand trines and whatever. Yeah. I'm mostly looking at how planets, aspecting planets affect the planet I'm concerned with in a particular issue. Wonderful. So someone may have like a strong Venus, but in square from, let's say, Saturn or from Mars, you know, I'm going to look mostly at the Venus. Okay.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm interested in this question as well. Are nodal reversals as important as nodal returns?
I don't go there yet. At this point, my interest mostly is understanding sort of how the nodes can influence planets, especially the visible planets in natal astrology. Transiting nodes, I have a little bit of suspicion about simply because the nodes are not planetary bodies. And I would say the same thing for reversals, not quite the same thing as, let's say, when Mercury goes retrograde and then stations direct. Okay.
Wonderful. So the natal planets square to the nodes are, in quotes, unstable, would you say?
You could say unstable. You could also say adaptive. I want to give the full range of possibilities because instability can be our need to improvise. Since we seem to know that the world tends to improvise on us all the time.
Wonderful, thank you. Do you consider planets in declination to the nodes?
Planets in declination to the nodes? No, because declination is about the sun. And the moon's latitude cycle is very much about the moon's relationship to not declination, but the sun's apparent path, the ecliptic. Declination is about, and we're going to talk about that forthwith. Declination is about the relationship of the circle of the zodiac and the circle of the celestial equator.
Wonderful, thank you. Regarding Rhetorius 80, what does the word exile mean there?
Exile. In those days, you really didn't want to get that far from home. And exile basically meant that you were being consigned to be a wanderer. And we could call it homeless today. So it's not like, me deciding that I'd rather, live in Italy than the United States. That's not exile.
Thank you. And maybe one more, and then we'll move on. What
Okay.
if, this is quite interesting one in terms of synastry. What if another person's nodes are at the bendings in synastry, is in like a karmic cross in a synastry chart? What do you think this does?
Interesting. I would look at the planets involved, and the nodes would certainly influence, the position of the nodes would certainly influence the planets and their expression. But I wouldn't consider if the nodes are involved strongly in synastry between two people, I would not consider that a karmic relationship necessarily.
Wonderful, thank you. And maybe the last one here, because I missed it as well, looking at the chat. To your answer, what you use in terms of mean or true node, if you can just clarify what you said there.
Okay, I believe, all right. I forget what default I put on my computer. I think I use mean node. Wonderful. Honestly, it's not something I care a whole lot about.
Thank you. I missed that too. And fantastic. Thank you. We'll move on from here. Thank you.
Okay. All right. There's more to do. All right. So we're going back here. And this is the sun's declination cycle. And obviously, it is the basis of our zodiac. It's also the basis of our seasons, northern or southern hemisphere. And so when the sun is conjunct 0 degrees of Aries, we have what they call the astronomical equinox, the Aries ingress. And then we go toward the solstice, which is coming up. We then go toward the autumn equinox and then the winter solstice. And so we have these this pattern And of course, at the summer solstice, the sun is overhead the Tropic of Cancer. The winter solstice, the sun is overhead Tropic of Capricorn. In the middle, the Aries-Libra axis, the sun is overhead the equator. We all learn this in the 4th grade, and sometimes we forget. So now we're going to talk about qualities. Hot, cold, wet, and dry. So we have, but first we have various cycles. The declination of the sun, which we just talked about. You could talk about the phases and pivots. In my 1998 article, I talked about the moon phases actually beginning not at the new moon in terms of quality, but the cold part of the cycle, which is the waning quarter moon, which would be associated with the sun in Capricorn, or I'll argue with the moon at the southern bendings. Then we have the diurnal cycle, and this would be going clockwise. Well, ascendant being birth, midheaven being culmination or some kind of flourishing, descendant being toward retirement or some kind of like extra thing towards, later in life, the IC being toward our death. And if we think about our lives, you can think of a cycle going increased wet, hot, dry, and cold. That the ascendant area, our youth, very wet. It's filled with potential. It's not very well formed. Also, when we're like infants and toddlers, we're just wet all the time. Then we get toward a greater expression of energy. We could call that hot. We simmer down toward midlife and afterwards. We're more defined. We have less energy, but we have more focus. That's dry. And cold, some of us have experienced some of that already. Less action, less mobility, more contemplative, perhaps. And now, think of the planets. What are the qualities of Venus and Jupiter in terms of hot, cold, wet, dry? And what are the qualities of Mars and Saturn? Hot, cold, wet, dry. Venus, sometimes it's considered cold, sometimes hot. I go toward hot personally. But definitely moist, wet. Jupiter, warm and moist. So the benefics are moist. Mars and Saturn. Mars is hot and dry. Saturn is cold and dry. What are Mars and Saturn? Dry. And I think you see where I'm going to go with this. Okay. Conjunct the North Node. Jupiter and Venus enhanced, both wet, watery part of the cycle. Watery part means assimilating, collaborating, bringing together. It can have like a specific form, but that form can dissolve and become another form. The northern bendings, likened to the summer solstice, favors the luminaries. Think about in terms of the sun. And this would be the sun's most northern declination. In terms of the moon's latitude cycle, would be the moon's largest latitude from the ecliptic. Then it goes south node, the dry part of the cycle, the nature of Mars and Saturn, the traditional folks say. What's dry? It's separating, taking apart. It is defining. And then the southern bending's more like the winter solstice, the cold part of the cycle, more Saturnian. I write here, a frosty version of Sagittarius-style Jupiter. So the rest of we're going to try this out a little bit. And I've gone from beta testing this to actually using this much more frequently with clients. So here's an example. And you may ask, what about the sun? And the sun conjunct the north node or the south node. Okay. On the right is me. Sun conjunct, and of course, there's a lot to say about anybody's chart. So we're just gonna look at this. This is 5 degrees. And I use the mean node here. I think the true node is a little closer. But okay, this would be the wet part of the cycle, conjunct the north node. And as you know, Sun in Capricorn is pretty cold. And so what this does is it's going to soften, it's going to moisten what could be a fairly dry Sun in Capricorn placement. So I'm too talkative and sympathetic to be your normal quote, Sun in Capricorn. You can look at other things like the fact that there's some watery planets that are disposing of my Sun, but what you get is a modification of the Sun's normal activity toward being wetter. And here's a Buddhist friend of mine I've done some astrology work with, and she has Sun in Pisces conjunct the south node. The south node is a dry part of the cycle. So she certainly has a lot of Pisces in her chart, and there's a lot of Pisces type characteristics modified by the fact that Jupiter is the dispositor and Jupiter is in Capricorn. But in terms of the Sun, and the Sun is our sense of identity, our sense of purpose, what we identify with, who we identify with. Simone is fairly distinct in what's important, what isn't important to her. In that sense, what the South Node does is it sort of dries up some of the wetness of Pisces, makes it far less wobbly and transient than otherwise it would be. And in terms of lunar purpose, I mean, what this does is it puts the Sun more in the quality of adaptation. So there's a flexibility that's also involved. So now we're going to do a romp around these 4 different pivot points. North node, northern bendings, south node, southern bendings. But first, I can stop here, see if anybody has need for more clarification, questions, comments. Disagreements are okay too.
Got some great questions coming in. There's a few of the same here talking about the nodes either being stationary or direct or retrograde. So what are your thoughts maybe in the natal charts of all those different matters? Someone saying they thought the nodes direct may be someone who beats to their own drum. What are your thoughts in general?
That sounds too much like extending to the nodes interpretations of planets when direct and retrograde. If you use the mean node, it will never be retrograde. If you use a true node, it will be sometimes. This is not something I've yet factored in to my understanding of the nodes. But if the questioner wants to do a lot of research and play around with it for a year and get back to me, I'd love to hear it.
Wonderful. Thank you.
This is an ongoing project.
Yeah, that's your task. Wonderful.
Yeah. I like to spread the work around a little bit.
So we've got a question here. Forgive me if you've answered this. I've been distracted with the questions. But where does the term bending come from? I don't know if you answered that before.
Okay. I forget what the Greek is. I knew it once, so I had it in a note somewhere. But the idea is that if you go from one direction to another, you have to stop somewhere. and the curve is going to flatten out a little bit. It's going to be like a bend in the road. So I think of the bendings like that. It's like at the northern bendings, you're going toward the northern latitude, and then you're changing direction toward the southern latitude. That's and you could say that the sun, when in Cancer or Capricorn, is at its northern or southern bendings, north being in Cancer, southern being in Capricorn. It's just a play of language.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's see here, other questions. I was once told that Pluto conjunct the South Node, it meant you had blood on your hands. It was from a very prominent astrologer for our day.
Okay.
Any thoughts?
Pluto conjunct, this is going to happen. People have Pluto conjunct the South Node. They don't have all blood on their hands. In this life, or, well, maybe in previous lives, we all have blood on our hands. There's going to be a tendency. Remember, the South Node is the dry part of the cycle. That Pluto conjunct the South Node may tend toward more extreme, limiting responses to things. I would be careful with Pluto conjunct the South Node, not to get rigid, not to catastrophize, but to look broadly at different possibilities and not to exclude some that you otherwise might exclude. That's how I would read that.
Wonderful. They jumped in as well, and I think they were talking about Putin. So interesting times. Moving on.
I'm mostly interested at this point in my work at the nodes and bendings conjunct the visible planets, but obviously we're going to bring in the outer planets as well.
Wonderful. Thank you. You mentioned the signs that the nodes are in don't matter. Do the houses lend any relevance in synthesizing with clients?
Well, okay, if you have, let's say with Simone, obviously she has South Node conjunct the Sun. They're in the 12th house. It's very different from an Aries ascendant governed by Mars with an opposition from Uranus. So I would definitely look at the node, not in terms of it being in the 12th, but in terms of it being next to the Sun that's in the 12th. So it's through the planets that the nodes sort of come to life. It also means that not everybody has real significant placement of the nodes and the bendings. It's very different from sort of the one-size-fits-all thing of whatever sign the North Node happens to be is your path in life. It's different here. Okay.
A couple more here. I think this is a health question. What if a malefic in bad condition is also a ruler of the ascendant? Would health also decline when it conjoins the South Node, especially in conjunction? There's a lot to unpack there.
It would depend on the sign, the malefic. Okay. If it's conjunct the South Node, either Mars or Saturn, and governing the ascendant, you're going to look for Mars or Saturn to really assist you defining your mode of response, defining how you adapt. The difficulty might be, especially if it's Saturn, that you have rigid rules for adaptation, that, you always use, you're always quiet, no matter what's happening, and that's how you deal with things. If it's Mars, it might be an adaptability that goes in the reckless direction. Again, and you'd have to look at more factors than chart to really get a handle on it in practice. But then using the node definitely enhances our understanding of how a planet may function when that planet is conjunct a node or the bendings.
Fantastic. We'll take one more here before we move on.
Yep.
Saying here, I'm very curious about the nodes that are by themselves, that aren't conjunct personal planets and don't really have anything at the bendings. Saying you've sort of touched on that, but can you expand on that?
Well, there's actually nothing to expand on, in the sense that maybe it's not that important where the nodes are if they're not conjunct a planet, or if the bendings are not conjunct a planet. The nodes are about, they're lunar. They help us understand lunar activities. They help us understand adaptation. They can be unstable. And maybe that's not a big deal in your chart. I mean, I have nothing in Gemini, and I have Mercury, but no Gemini. It's okay. I get through life without Gemini. Most of my friends are happy I get through life without Gemini, but that's different. Okay. Let's move toward people. So what I'm going to do is, starting with the North Node, I'm going to look at different planets in different charts. Some of these charts I talk about in my latest book. Some of them, like this one, I don't. And you'll be familiar with some of these people, maybe less familiar with others. I grew up sort of a fan of Boston sports teams, and Bill Russell was clearly at the top of the heap at that time. And he has, and this is just gorgeous, Saturn conjunct the North Node, and the Sun's there too. So the North Node, remember, is the wetter part of the cycle, and he's got a ton of planets in Aquarius. But what the North Node does is it gives a quality of bringing things together creatively. So Bill Russell was a relatively short center in basketball, meaning he was only 6'9", not like 7'4", like they tend to show up these days. He also won about 10 or 11 championships, and he was a consummate team player. He was tenacious in his own way. He had no illusions about who he was. And of course, he was sort of a star during the Civil Rights era. And he insisted that Boston was just as racist as towns in the South. Of course, us Northern liberals would like scoff at that, but he was absolutely right. But what he did is he basically lowered his head and played basketball. He was not terribly outspoken, but he would tell the truth as he would see it. He just died maybe 2 years ago. But here's a person who definitely had a sense of who he was, but all in a, let's say, as a spokesperson, but also knew that he was just a basketball player. This was the decades before LeBron James would have a more expansive outlook. And so it's Saturn in the sense of being defined and sort of clear, although with the North Node there, there's also we'll call it a creativity involved. Very different from my next person, Emily Dickinson, who never played basketball. Although she lived near where basketball was invented, and she has North Node also conjunct Saturn, but in Virgo. Very different person, much more restricted in her life, although even though she was unrecognized during her lifetime, is that, one of the two great American poets of the 19th century. And for someone who lived a fairly restricted life as a spinster in Amherst, Massachusetts, she wrote about things she saw in her backyard. She wrote about death loneliness, the human condition, but not from, she did not write epic poetry. Most of her things were like 6 to 8 lines long, very densely packed, but also having that sort of wet quality of bringing a lot of things together. So that's Emily Dickinson. So we're going from planets conjunct the node to the northern bendings, okay? And we have here's Vladimir Putin. He's been in the news lately, not in a very praiseworthy way, but he has Jupiter at the northern bendings. Okay, going counterclockwise from the north node to Jupiter, fairly close. It's in Taurus. And I think of Jupiter as a planet of sort of inclusiveness. It's also in the hotter or more active part of the cycle. And I think of the nationalism that Putin espouses and his desire to sort of redo the USSR. And I think that, you know, his mother was rescued from a pile of corpses during the siege of Leningrad. And his nationalism is very much in response to what he perceives as the humiliation of the breakup of the Soviet Union. And so here's Jupiter. Here is like a very sort of strong, passionate point of view, but it's based not on, you know, who I am, but sort of recovering some kind of lost glory. And that feels very much like, it feels very lunar in a lot of ways. And then we get, also at the northern bendings, if we're going to do Putin, I have to do the opposite, which is Hannah Arendt, who, now she has Mercury at the northern bending. So here is the north node at 7 degrees of Leo. Here's Mercury at 4 degrees of Scorpio. Now there is a mutual reception with Mars, which obviously has helped her sort of as an advocate writer. But, you know, she also has a background of, we'll call it trauma. As a young adult, her job was to write on the emerging power of Nazism for a Zionist journal in Germany. She eventually wound up fleeing Germany, going to France, having to flee France when the Nazis took over, going to America, and becoming this very prolific political theoretician and philosopher. And she also wrote about totalitarianism as I think partly was her therapy. And as you can see, that Mercury is involved with a lot of things, including Saturn and Moon. And so what we have is this strong sort of active expression, but she's doing it in this sort of Mercury and Scorpio way of, okay, I'm going to give you the history of how Nazism took over Germany, how Germany is like what happened with Stalin in Russia, and how Eichmann was just not a monster, but just someone who just went along with things. Got her in a bit of trouble with her fellow Jewish community. Okay. And then someone you're more familiar with, Carl Jung, also Mercury at the northern bendings. Here's North Node, 11 degrees of Aries. So he would be born near a time of a major lunar standstill, by the way. And you'll see Mercury is within 2 degrees of a square. Venus is a little outside. So as you know, Jung began as a student of Freud, as a psychoanalyst, working with, unlike Freud, who worked with garden variety neurotic people like you and me, Jung worked with more psychotic patients in mental institutions. But as you also know, he fused mythology and alchemy with art, a lot of other things. And he was also, and this is, I think, the hot part of the cycle, he was also somewhat of a prophet. Freud accused him in one of his talks of, he sort of sold out and decided to become a prophet instead of a scientist. And I agree with Freud. Jung died in the 60s, and his influence is pretty much unwaning to this day. And a lot of the modern, sort of like Hannah Arendt, a lot of modern understanding has been shaped by his work many decades ago. So we've talked about planets conjunct the North Node, the northern bendings. Now let's go to the South Node. Alice Bailey, who some of you will know very well. And this is interesting because obviously she had this, major, we'll call it spiritual influence. Most things that we consider New Age are kind of, she had some hand in, not directly, but indirectly. You'll notice that Mercury has major planets in aspect, especially Neptune in the 10th, no surprise there, as well as Jupiter in Aries in the 9th. So very much a religious orientation. What does Mercury conjunct the South Node do? This is the dry part of the cycle. Mercury makes things defined. It separates. And for all there are two ways in which this worked. One way is that for all the various strands of theosophy that she used, she really focused on some very few, I don't want to call them simple, very basic ideas of the 7 rays. But also, most of the work attributed to her was not, she would not say was done by her, but by this enlightened being who was speaking through her. She wrote very little that was from her pen alone. And so there's sort of a humility that she also had with, in spite of the fact that she has Mars and conjunct ascendant in Leo and all kinds of very active and engaged planetary placements. So here's Mercury conjunct the South Node. And then Angela Merkel, Jupiter conjunct the South Node. Jupiter conjunct the South Node. And again, South Node is the dry part. And this is Jupiter in Cancer. And Jupiter in Cancer can be very empathic and visionary and all of that. The South Node restricts it. And so, Merkel, who was East German scientist, went into politics after the Berlin Wall fell, rose quickly because she was somewhat Machiavellian in her entire approach to life. But her idea of, quote, nationalism from a German point of view was economic and managerial. And she basically, in sort of an oblique way, kind of ran the EU for many years and also held NATO together during the Trump presidency. And so what we have here is an application of Jupiter that actually is fairly narrow and contained. And I'm going to attribute that to the conjunction with the South Node. So we've had the North Node, northern bendings, South Node, what's left but the southern bendings. And here's one of my favorite people, Fred Rogers. Very different from Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin and Malcolm X and folks like that. Here, it's the moon involved. And see how the south node is at 13 degrees of Sagittarius. The moon is 11 degrees of Pisces. So the moon is at 5 degrees of southern latitude. Even if it's in Pisces, which is fairly close to the ecliptic or to the celestial equator. And what's interesting about, I mean, there's a lot to say about his chart and his approach, and I've written about him quite a bit, actually. What I find fascinating about this placement is his unhappy childhood as sort of upper middle class, fairly neglected, fat, unpopular. Nobody was particularly interested in who he was. And he used this background as a means to understand and work in his television programs with children who went through some of the same things that he did when growing up. So in some ways, his moon helped navigate the difficulties. Now, remember, the south bendings are more Saturnine. They're melancholic. They're depressive, you can even call them. And I think it's that sort of depressive part of the cycle that actually helped him be empathic and to appreciate the value in everybody. So it's sort of like an enhanced survival mechanism in his case. And here's Pablo Casals, different person from Fred Rogers, but here Jupiter's at the southern bendings. And you notice it's a very strong Jupiter. You know, may have Sun in Capricorn in the 6th, and we know he worked hard and all that. But there's Jupiter and Venus in the 5th house. Here's the south node in Virgo. Here's Jupiter in Sagittarius. And what this does is it gives Jupiter a sort of a reserve, a melancholy. Here's a person who worked very hard at his musical gifts. I quote him quite a bit when he was like 92 and people asked him, why do you still practice the cello? And he said, well, I'm beginning to see some improvement. It's not a bad way to go through life. But it also attests to a certain Saturnine point of view. Also, he had a very strong aversion to Generalissimo Franco and the fascists in Spain. Was on the wrong side of the Spanish Civil War, wound up helping refugees from southern France, refused to play in any country that recognized Franco's regime. He later had to go back on that because too many countries did that. But there is a sort of cold, unyielding, almost desperate quality to how he encountered Franco. And yes, melancholy is adaptive, or it can be adaptive, because what you do is the cold part of the cycle. So you're not only focused, that's dry, but you're also unyielding. You're like dry ice in some ways. And so this little romp ends with Vincent van Gogh, who's a combination. Again, here's Jupiter and also Moon at the southern dry part of the cycle, southern node, south node, or the descending node. And square is, here's the south node at 23. square is Jupiter, that's also conjunct Venus. And of course, Venus is in its exaltation. Jupiter, I'm sorry, not Jupiter, Mars. And so, all right, the dry part is his focus. Before he was an artist, before he decided he would be a painter, he was going to be a preacher. And he was too intense for the ministerial community where he was. He wanted to work with poor people. And he was quite the strong advocate for them. He went into painting in part because he has some background in it, but also because it had its transcendental possibilities for him. At the same time, as everyone knows, he sold like 2 paintings in his lifetime, and he continued. He defined himself in terms of who he was going to be and what he was going to do. And he kept to that. Come hell or high water, and if he was confined to a mental institution, he was going to do his paintings of what he sees from his bed. You can look at the cold part of the cycle and his Mars, also his Venus. You could look at that in terms of some of his paintings, certainly, but also his rather tortured love life, which doesn't mean that if you have Venus or Mars conjunct the southern bendings, you have a tortured love life, but he certainly did. And it's clear to me that he sort of set himself up for failure. And I think part of that is he knew that his focus was going to be in life was going to be pretty narrow. And I think he needed sort of the passionate quality of being in love, but I'm not sure it would have worked out if he had to actually have a woman as a partner. So, and enough. Okay. Slide 38 of 38. Questions, comments, thoughts, reflections.
Thank you, Joseph. An
dreams.
absolutely brilliant presentation, and everyone appreciates the diversity of the charts. Absolutely fascinating chart examples. Wonderful. I don't know if you can see all the hearts coming through.
I see all this flutter stuff coming up. Yes,
that's right. It's funny when we got to Fred Rogers, I couldn't see the screen for all the hearts coming up, so that was funny.
Fred sort of does that to people, huh?
I think that's what it.
I didn't see as many hearts with Putin, I don't think.
Yeah, maybe not as many, or any. Wonderful. Okay, do you have time for this? Might be quite an extensive Q&A session because we have so many questions.
Well, whatever.
Okay, I'm fine. I'm quite liberal with time, so.
So am I. So go for it.
I will apologize for everyone. We probably won't get to everybody.
Oh, by the way, if Francis O'Neill has had a raised hand, I'm not sure what you want to do with that.
Oh, that's fine. We'll just go through the Q&A that has popped.
Okay, fine. All right.
And again, I will apologize. We won't be able to get to everyone's questions, but thank you. Such a interactive chat. Absolutely brilliant. Okay, on to the first one. Let's see here. If the North Node has a moistening characteristics, does it soften the malefics in conjunction as opposed to an increase in quotes evil?
Yes. Good.
Okay.
Somebody was listening. Bravo or brava. Good.
Okay. Have you noticed whether or not a chart sect influences the scope of the nodal cycles in a life? In other words, might the sun's declination cycle be more influential in diurnal charts, while the moon's nodal cycle is more influential in nocturnal charts?
10 years ago, I would have said yes. These days, I'm not sure. I've begun to think that the sun's qualities and the moon's qualities always should be, one should not have preference over the other, regardless of daytime or nighttime birth. You know, we all have to survive bodily on this planet and deal with all kinds of physical responses and work with the rhythms of life at the same time, we have our longings and our identities and who we think we are. And I think they're always in some kind of a disequilibrium. So that's a more complicated answer to a very simple question, I'm afraid.
Thank you so much. Let's see here. In my practice and own life, I have observed people passing in one's life when the North Node is transiting the 8th house. Has Joseph observed this in his research/practice? And they've said here, of course, there would be other factors to consider.
Not yet. But here's a person I would love to hear from if there's some good research that I could look at. So I invite this person to do this.
Wonderful, fantastic. We've got some specific planets here. Let's see, putting these questions together. How would you interpret Saturn at the bendings as well? We've got here Uranus. And do you consider Uranus a benefic or malefic? What are your thoughts?
Okay.
Trying to tie in these questions.
Saturn at the northern or southern bendings would have different functions. A Saturn at the northern bendings might be more effusive, more Saturnine in a active way, whereas Saturn at the southern bendings may be more contained. That's one part. What's the second part of the question, Callum?
No, thank you. And I think the other planet was Uranus. And do you
Uranus.
Yeah.
Malefic, benefic. Uranus doesn't care about being malefic or benefic. It does whatever it wants. And it doesn't care about our happiness or misery. It just runs amok when it's active.
Runs amok. I love it.
We have to catch up to it.
Fantastic. It says here, could you clarify if the south node is dry and the north is wet? What keyword would we use for the bendings? Maybe adaptable?
Oh, okay. All right. Northern bendings. Hot, active, engaged, effusive. The southern bendings would be more contained, contemplative. The northern bendings are a little more like the Indian version of Rahu, and the southern bendings are a little more like the Indian version of Ketu. So check those keywords and see if there's a fit there.
Wonderful. What if the bendings are exactly conjunct the ascendant/descendant? And maybe that ties into another question. What if you have the nodes on the ascendant/descendant?
Mozart had his north node conjunct the ascendant. I think, all right, my first tendency would be to look at the planet in charge and see where the planet is in relationship to the ascendant and the node. I'm not sure the node would increase our understanding of that planet's functioning, but it might increase the power of the ascendant or descendant or midheaven.
Wonderful. Your thoughts on, do you consider conjunctions to the fixed stars? I'm not sure if they're talking about, what are your thoughts, fixed stars in general, maybe if the bendings or...
I'm a big fan of Paranatella, which involves stars and planets, not nodes.
Maybe that should be another webinar in itself.
Later
on, okay.
Some other time, yes.
Some other time, wonderful. What would you look to if the bendings were conjunct a stellium?
I would look, of course, at planets. Well, you'd have to factor in all the planets, and if they're within a certain, let's say, 4-degree or 5-degree orb. If they're all there, you have a lot of heat or cold. And you'd have to factor that in. And again, it would depend on what you want to know from the chart. If you want to know their athletic ability or their, how good a lover they are, everything and anything in between.
Wonderful. Sorry, I'm going through these questions. Is it fair to say that in your research you are finding that the nodes are to be used as modifiers to a planetary energy, rather than how some modern astrologers use them, like the planets, to represent certain things? If so, how
Yes,
did you reach that conclusion?
yes, exactly. What this person just said.
Yeah.
You got it.
To answer
Good.
their own question.
You absolutely.
Let's see here. Are there any adjustments made for charts in Placidus or other house systems?
Doesn't matter. We're interested in planets and how the nodes affect the planets.
Okie dokie. Any thoughts on, let me see if I can condense this question down. How about aspects to asteroids? Do you work with asteroids, and what would that look like?
Asteroids, all right. I have this sort of, is it hierarchy? I don't know what you would call it, but the greatest range of meaning are for the luminaries, then for the 5 visible planets, then for the outer planets, then for the asteroids. So if you talk about Chiron, I'm specifically interested, let's say, in, if you consider Chiron an asteroid, although it's not in the asteroid belt, that, you know, Chiron as a teacher, as a mentor, as someone to work with a body of knowledge and pass it along. If that planet is on the node of the bendings, I would consider that. The other asteroids I don't use so much, but I'm certainly not. It's like I have a full plate with the planets I know.
You got plenty of information there. Wonderful. Someone's asking, can you explain moist and dry cycle again? I think they're trying to soak that all in.
All right. We're looking at the beginning as moist or wet. And I think of the life cycle that way, maybe because I'm getting older and I'm getting drier. I also have less hair than I used to. And so we sort of start wet. We think about the fact that we start with all these neurons that we have to like cut in the first couple of years of life. Think about the fact that when we're born, we're receptive to all kinds of sounds of all kinds of languages, and that starts to prune fairly quickly in the first year. A Chinese kid will recognize Chinese sounds. I wouldn't, being raised in Boston. Okay, so we have this sort of undifferentiated potentiality, we could call that the wet part. It combines, it can do all kinds of different things, different containers. Then we move toward warmth. And warmth is more effusive, is more active. It's like what we were when we were adolescent, full of energy, and we could stay up all night and not fall asleep too much in class the next day. And we had this vivid fantasy life, and our parents had to hold us down to get us to eat a meal. That is warm. Then dry is I have a job, I have a career, I have a relationship. Things are defined. They're pruned down. Dry is, and that would be toward the south node. It is, it has fewer possibilities, but it has more focus. And then the cold is, there's more focus and there's also less activity. And so I remember my mother would she would sleep in these 3-hour intervals, 3 times a day. And she could only do so much activity, then she had to lie down. And I think we know as we get older, we're doing fewer things. Or if you're me, you're doing the same things, but you need to recover for longer. That's cold. Cold is also more contemplative. As people, think of the stages of an Indian ascetic. At the end, they're sort of wandering the forest, having done their family and done their career. And they have a more contemplative life. And that would be cold. obviously, one could go on, but I won't.
I was going to say, taking from that, so naps are a good thing. That's what I'm taking.
Yeah.
To recharge and re-energize. Wonderful.
Yes. Yes.
Fantastic. And again, I apologize, we won't be able to get to all questions. So for the last question of today, what books do you recommend in terms of learning more about the nodes, and what are your recommendations?
I'm finishing some articles. What we've been talking about today is mostly in the first part. In the second part, which I hope to do this summer, I want to do more critique of the modern tendencies toward using the nodes. My Astrology in the Lives of People is pretty good for planetary potentials that we all have. The nodes sort of enhance that or give that a little bit more of a quality of hot, cold, wet, or dry. Otherwise, I'm kind of at a loss. I like people to look at the first book of Ptolemy's Heterobiblos, which is all about using these cycles in terms of astrological factors. So definitely use Ptolemy.
Fantastic. So we've got a part 2 coming up.
An article.
Oh, an article. Is that what you?
Okay, an article when Kepler leaves.
No plans to write.
I'm not doing so many classes. I can actually write the damn thing.
Absolutely wonderful. Well, thank you so, Joseph, for an absolutely brilliant presentation. I can't wait to rewatch it myself. And we'll just to reiterate, we'll be out on our YouTube channel in the next couple of days. And Joseph, if you want to find out more about Joseph, it's what's the website again?
It's easy. Astrologyinstitute.com. I am very pleased I got that domain name.
Wonderful, wonderful. And we'll clear, if you go to our YouTube channel, once you see the video, we'll have all the links below in the description box and the comments boxes.
You also see my picture often enough on the Kepler's publicity. So, do join me there too.
Fantastic. And Joseph, you actually got some other great webinars out on our YouTube channel. I think you've got Dante's. So if you guys want to check out other work by Joseph, absolutely brilliant.
I had more hair then when I did that webinar.
Fantastic. Well, I don't know if you can see all the hearts coming up and the last, but thank you all for joining us all around the world.
None of those. Okay, very good. Okay,
KeplerCollege community, all worldwide. Thank you all for joining us today, and we'll see you in the next one next week.
Okay. Very good.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.